Hey, today we're going to be talking about exactly what is mining and the process of an ore and how it kind of goes through the process of being into a pure element or how it makes its way onto the into a store, for example. So first, we're going to kind of vaguely define what mining is, but in a nutshell, it's basically bringing elements or ores, compounds from under the earth to above the earth. So we're just extracting elements from the earth. Um, but in the first stage, there's a wide variety of mining, from open pit mining to underground mining. And basically, in this stage, we're just looking for minerals that have the element we want inside them, and we want to extract that from the earth. But there's two main types of mining. There's much more methods that one could use. One would be underground mining, which is often associated with mining in general. And there's also open pit mining, which is essentially not digging a hole underground, but it's rather formed by kind of natural occurrences on the earth, and you can find some minerals along the edges of the cliff of your underground mine. But let's compare the two first of all. So first, an open pit mine is cheaper because you don't have to kind of find your way through. Like in a underground mine, you have to buy a lot of gear and you have to um, uh, really detect where the elements are, which is going to take a lot more time and a lot more gear. Um, so uh, open pit mine is much cheaper. Um, the disadvantage of an open pit mine is that you can find less resources. In most resources, like you can find in underground mines, but open pit mine only limits you to a certain element you want to find. And uh, generally, things like gold, you have to go underground mining to find that. Um, in mining, you can find minerals, compounds, or a mixture of elements, both useful and non-useful. So when you're mining, you could be looking for a specific element, but rather you would have to extract it furthermore from a just a rock. So you're actually getting a lot more mass than you will end up with in the very end after processing. So after we find the elements or the ores we need, we will go through a lot of process to get uh, the element in its pure form and on to the consumers. So usually the first thing that is used to process these minerals or ores or whatever, it's usually crushed. So we have to crush these minerals to make them smaller. They're usually crushed on site of the mining, or sometimes they're shipped to other places for being crushed. But we need to break these huge rocks into tiny pieces, which are like more easily transported or and more easier to modify in further processes in our mine processing of the minerals. Um, because usually to process these ores or minerals, you have to put the put them on a conveyor belt, and it would require small bits and pieces of the ore for that to work. So usually after the initial grinding, they could be kept somewhere for a while, this granulated mineral or whatever we have left. Or sometimes if there's still large pieces, it could go through the grinding process again to make it smaller for processing. So after you have the initial processing done, which is just grinding up the ores and minerals, it's either A, put into a conveyor belt. These conveyor belts can reach up to 2 kilometers long directly into a processing plant, or it could be transported by trucks, for example, or it could be processed on site. So you could also have a very advanced processing site really near your mine site. Uh, all, all these three are possible scenarios of where the mineral goes after it gets crushed. So what happens in the processing plant? Well, in the processing plant, the minerals are further processed so that we can reach a pure form of the mineral. There's humans have found many unique and smart ways to process these elements through experience and experimentation. But a few common ones that I'll name off would be magnetic forces to remove some minerals, like steel, for example, is possible because they want to separate uh, some metals and nonmetals. That's a very common way. Another example would be slurry. Compounds that contain cyanide could be added to dissolve minerals like gold. So, like just generally an additional or an additive. Um, they could be diluted in water and further additives by just adding more compounds into the water, or you could separate them by density. So that's also possible. Another possible processing would be adding heat. You could evaporate certain elements based on their different boiling points and melting points. And another thing would be the anode and cathode method, which means just kind of separating positive and negative charges. So usually after the initial processing, your elements or ores are going to be very pretty pure, and usually they're further reprocessed by another method. For example, it could be a mixture of any of these two, any of the five I've given above, or they could be further treated. For example, 3 to 4 methods are possible, but usually it's 2 to 3. And it usually goes through some minor reprocessing called basically refining. And in this process, you're just making minor dilutions, minor changes, so that you'll get the purest form of the element that you can get. These are usually small processes, and there's a ton of ways you can do that. And then the next thing would be disposal of the elements slash minerals that you don't need. So the elements you got rid of are usually backfilled into the mine if you're done with the mine. So you just kind of dump the useless elements or waste products back into the mine, or it could go into a pond or a waterway, and just this water would be furtherly treated at a water treatment plant. So these two are all possible options. And then usually after you get rid of the byproducts, you you have a very pure element, and using this element, it's in its pure form, but sometimes human want to further kind of organize these elements, and they organize them into, for example, ingots, and these kind of jagged shaped or whatever, they go into a collection. So like a brick, for example, like a gold brick, to just better for storage and better for kind of just more organized. And other elements could go to form alloys. For example, copper would go and form bronze. So that would be further processing. And yeah, after this process, um, we'll have a lot of elements that are very organized in bulk, and these elements can be shipped off to stores, factories for processing, or just anywhere on Earth.